So where shall we begin? We will begin with what our objectives are for today. We want to talk about what regression and recoupment means, particularly in the context of our kids going back to school. We talk about a little bit about how schools measure and address regression, how that would be handled in a typical year, and what things are likely to be different this year. I'm going to talk a bit about the DESE guidance on compensatory services, both because it's brand new and it relates very much to your special education families, and because there's a good section in it on general education supports for recovery, so it applies to all students. I'm going to show you a short video that was done. As I said, the DESE guidance came out on Monday, and on Tuesday, the Federation had a really excellent video with an attorney from Cote and Crabtree and Strong. It's about 17 minutes long, and she covers much faster than I will all of the interesting parts of the compensatory services. Then I want to talk about special concerns for ongoing remote learning, because we're all facing that, and how we help our families prepare kids for school and prepare the families for school. I would like to also use this time to discuss what your experiences are and what your concerns are. One thing I've noticed in webinars lately is I think people have a lot of Zoom fatigue, and sometimes I'm asking for comments or questions and things aren't necessarily coming up, and that's okay, but I think that we are facing a tough situation with going back to school, with how much our kids are likely to have regressed, and particularly with how much it's hurt some of our more vulnerable populations. Kids with special needs, who I work with, of course, but also our families of color, our families of lower income, kids who were already behind, kids who couldn't access learning in the spring. This is likely to be a very major problem. And I showed this presentation to a colleague, and she said, wow, what a bummer. This is like so negative. And what I realized was, some of this data might look pretty grim, but you are not a group of people and organizations that sit back and take the status quo. You are going to be out there looking for ways to address this and help these kids and help our most vulnerable kids. And I honestly think that you can tell each other as much as I can tell you about how we're all going to try to do this. So I would really, really appreciate, you don't have to turn on your camera, but just, I've got a couple of whiteboards set up so that we can have people sharing, their thoughts on a whiteboard. I've got a couple of polls we might do. We'll just see how the conversation goes, but I really want your input. Okay. So let's get, oops, I went backwards. Let's get into some of the details of regression. Regression that we talk about with schools starts with academic skills regression, which is a very common thing. It happens every year to at least some of our students. It's the loss of information or school skills after a period of interruption or school, like summer vacation, long absences. Some regression is expected, and it's so common it has a name. It's called the summer slide, hence the scared-looking little kid. Students recoup at different rates, and some kids don't lose a lot. And we know historically that kids of lower income, Black and Hispanic kids are more likely to have regression in a typical summer. We know that kids who have other obligations going on, kids who are working in the summer, childcare for siblings, things like that, tend to have more issues. So we expect them to recoup at different rates. We also know that for our kids who get special education, there are sometimes extended school year services, and I'll talk a little bit about the criteria for that around recoupment, just because I think it gives you the concept, but extended school year services are different from what we're talking about now with what DESE is calling COVID Compensatory Services, or CCS. You're going to get all the details on this, but many special education students receive some form of extended school year services to help them not regress as much. And unfortunately this year, that was not something that happened a lot in person. Some programs were able to do it, but a lot of it was remote, and we're not sure how effective it was. Okay, we also need to talk about social and emotional regression. We tend to think about this with younger children, reverting to an earlier stage of development, an earlier behavior. It's a normal part of development for young kids. It can include tantrums, refusing to do schoolwork, regression and potty training, intense and unpredictable emotions. Sleep difficulties are incredibly common. And that's not just for younger children. I think anybody who has lived with a teenager going through a major transition can tell you that all of these kinds of social and emotional regression can be very common at all ages. Well, okay, not the potty training, hopefully. But regression also communicates distress. Behavior is communication, we always say, and in this case, it can be communicating stress, frustration. It can be changes in events like the birth of a sibling, a change of routine, things like that. But it can also be traumatic events and big stresses like the COVID pandemic. So we have to think about how we're going to handle the emotional regression of going back to school too. All the research says families need to focus on being safe, secure, nurturing, keeping in routine, keeping in rituals, and being very positive with reinforcement. Don't punish kids, because this is not something they've got a lot of control over, even though it's not fun to go through as a parent. Recoupment is a term that means regaining the lost skills and information once school goes back into session. The way DESE talks about recoupment is around extended school year, but I think it's valuable to think about for kids who've had a lot of regression now. Significant regression and slow recoupment are interrelated, and that may happen for a lot of kids this year. They will, have a loss of their performance level where they were before the break. And in this case, the break might even have started in March. We don't know how much kids have been able to learn or retain with remote learning, and there's so much variation that, it's anybody's guess overall. If the child has a limited learning rate for whatever reason, which could be going through traumatic events, stress, emotional, as well as disabilities around learning, it can lengthen the amount of time it takes to review and relearn the previous material, and that puts the child farther behind their class. So that's why, to try to avoid that, that's why they do extended school year for kids with disabilities. But you'll probably hear the term recoupment, so it's important to just do the definition. Okay, so what's a typical year look like for regression? We are not talking about this year. Early research, when I say early, I mean it's old, it's like a couple of decades old, but cited very often is that student achievement scores tend to decline about 1 month over a summer break, the typical summer break. Now that's overall, some kids are more, some are less. Overall, we see greater declines in math than in reading. Some families read all summer but don't necessarily do math drills, so that's not unexpected. The declines are higher at the higher grade levels, which is interesting to me because, we're putting a big priority on getting our younger kids back into in-person instruction, and that makes sense because they need the social and emotional growth, but our high school kids are more at risk for having lost some of their achievement in terms of learning. Declines are not equal across all students. I think we all know that. Some kids have sailed through this COVID break and done really well and, gotten a lot out of it and really enjoyed it. And I'm sure they're the minority, but some kids like online learning. Of course, some kids couldn't access it at all. So unfortunately, we have a large population of kids who are coming back with learning gaps. We know that lower income students, as well as Black and Hispanic students, tend to lose more information over the summer historically, and this is probably compounded under COVID. And it's really unfortunate because they're sort of starting out a new school year a step down the ladder, and they don't need that it can really increase the achievement gaps. So hopefully in a typical year, it's a temporary increase as the kids can all catch up, but nothing is typical. So what will regression look like this year? We don't know. That's the answer. I looked at a fair amount of research. There are some very technical reports out. McKinsey did a big technical report on how much regression is going to affect the gross domestic product in 10 years. And it's, yeah, I think it's anticipated to be a pretty serious impact. But there are a lot of variables, and they're not going to be the same for every district. The model of education that the district chose and how well they did it in the spring and this fall are both going to have really big impacts on how fast kids can recoup and really how much they lost in the first place. Still, student ability to access remote learning. There's multiple factors in that. There are the technical ones. Do they have access to the equipment? Do they have a space where they can learn? Do they have internet access? Hopefully some of these have gotten better, but my understanding from talking to lots of you is that we're not at 100% there. And also, we know that different students have different abilities to be able to access remote learning. Some kids just learn much better in the classroom than they can even in a synchronous kind of online learning where they're working directly with the teacher. How districts address the problems of inequitable access and absenteeism is going to be a really big issue. And I'm going to touch back on this. I think many people are worried about this. The approach of a district can be, when they're having trouble getting kids engaged, it can be prevention approaches, re-engagement. It can also be a more punitive approach, looking at things like truancy filings. The approach the district takes is going to make a big difference in how much kids are engaged and how much they can recoup. And as I said, it's likely that some of our students, particularly our more vulnerable students, are going to have greater levels of regression and a harder time recouping. So how much academic regression can we expect? It's kind of a crapshoot, honestly, looking at the literature. I don't think that there's necessarily a lot of good estimates. One I thought was sort of reasonable came out of the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. And what they did is they went back and looked at summer learning patterns for 5 million students. And then they also looked at previous research on things like the impacts of missing school due to absenteeism, school closures, Hurricane Katrina, all kinds of things were figured in. And they came up with a model and estimates that suggest that about 2/3 of the learning gains in reading are what we can pretty much expect. Kids will probably have lost about 1/3 of last year's learning in reading, and somewhere around half or more of their learning gains in math. So these are very big gaps compared to what we've seen before. If this turns out to be a reasonable estimate, we're just not going to know until we live it. So how do schools measure regression? In a typical year, a teacher going into a classroom would use data from the previous year's assessments, typically done at the end of the year. They would do benchmark assessments in the fall. They would use that information to do targeted learning for the students to try to differentiate the instruction. But this year, they don't have assessments in the spring for the most part. Parent input is incredibly important. And this ties back to what I'm going to harp on later in the presentation about parent communication with the school is just really going to be key. And we know it's really hard for some of our families. But the parents have to say what they've seen in terms of what the students were able to do, if they've seen particular regression. That all needs to be noted for the school, not just special education. But in special education, we know that some of the spring progress reports were pretty rosy looking compared to what the parents had seen. I've heard that from a lot of parents. They were based on conclusions that they didn't have data for. And really, we have to address that, including putting comments onto the progress reports for those kids that really detail what the parents' experience was. Because it's always good to document in special education. You always want the parents to be documenting as much as they can. But even if they didn't document, even if it's anecdotal that they saw, whatever reactions they had from their student, it's important to get that in writing and get it to the school, because it's going to play into what kind of extra services the student may be able to access. Okay. In terms of assessments, How the teacher looks at the assessments, kind of typical benchmark assessments, are going to be very different this year. Some districts are going back in person and may be able to do some of those in person in a typical way. I think, though, that a lot of us are going to end up having to do it remotely. And how they do the assessments, what assessments they use, all kinds of things about learning are going to vary by the district, by the school, by the teacher. Teachers do things differently even in the same grade. They may be using benchmark assessments that they would use in a classroom, but using them remotely. Doing it that way is not normed, as they say, in that you can't compare it to a population of kids who took the assessments in person, but it's still useful because, I mean, that's what we've got. And it can give information about where the student is now, and then you can compare it to future progress. So assessments, even if they're done remotely, to help understand how the students are doing what they've retained are very important. Parent advice. This one's might not seem obvious to parents, but a lot of parents are used to kind of being in the role of the teacher and really helping their student during online learning. When they're doing assessments, the parent should not assist the student, because if they do, you're not getting a reflection of what the student can actually do. My colleague Bridget Cage, who was a special ed teacher for 20 years, said, walk away if you have to. So it's hard. It's hard to watch a child struggle, but the teacher needs to know what's going on. But the other advice that Bridget gave is, if the assessment is too upsetting or frustrating for the student, stop it and tell the teacher what's going on. I mean, a note that tells the teacher that for a typical, 5-minute assessment, the student worked on it for 20 minutes and was incredibly frustrated. That tells them a great deal about the fluency of the skills that the student has, how fast they can do those kinds of tasks. So they don't necessarily have to complete it to understand what's going on with them, and you don't want them getting too frustrated. Okay. First opportunity for questions and comments. Do we have any questions in the chat? Do people have questions for me about this information?
No questions in the chat just yet.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to give you guys a poll, just because I'm curious for what you're looking at with your districts and what they're doing for learning this year. I know we have district plans just come out, but what are you seeing? Are they going hybrid, fully remote? Does it vary by grade? So if you could just take a moment, if you can do the poll. I know people on the phone are going to have a problem with that, but just let us know what you're seeing. And if people have other models and you want to put it in the chat, that's fine too. I noticed when I was going through the different towns and their plans, DESE put out a list as of last, I want to say Friday, that's going to be updated, of course, as they get more information. But a few districts were doing hybrid in elementary and remote in the secondary grades. And I thought that was a really interesting approach, that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Because there's a big push to help bring back the early learners, and honestly, I think it's probably easier to keep those kids safe. Anybody who's ever spent any time in a middle school or high school, the idea of social distancing, even if only half the kids are in the building, oh boy. So, okay, well, it looks like you've gotten some good responses. I'll just leave it up for another couple of seconds, and then anybody who else wants to add. It looks like a lot of people are going hybrid. So we are going to be working with trying to get kids adjusted to both learning models as we go back. And that's going to have some interesting challenges. Although it looks like 20-ish% of us are going fully remote for right now, and another 20% fully remote for the foreseeable future until we get to something else. So that's a chunk too for people who are going to have to deal with only remote learning. Okay, so those are the poll results. Very interesting, I think. Okay. Any other questions? All right. I'm going to show you a video because I changed up my presentation to do this video instead of just me going talk, 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 because I think that Melanie Jarbo, who's from Cote and Crabtree and Strong, they're one of the very best special education law firms anywhere, really. Bob Crabtree actually helped write the law in Massachusetts that went on to become IDEA. So I'm going to show you Melanie's video. It's about 17 minutes, and she crams in a lot to it. So don't worry, if you want her slides, I've got them. Oops, backwards. So I'm going to change my screen share. With any luck, this will work just fine. Okay. Oh no, sorry, this is bouncing around. I am going to have to go back and do this again. Give me just one moment, and if it doesn't work, I will keep talking and come back to it. But I think I can make it work. All right, let's see if we can screen share Melanie. Tossing our finger. Just wait a second. Now, tell me if you can hear the sound. Just nod or shake. Can you hear it? Looks like a no. Okay. I know what to do. See, I am getting good at this, or better. Okay, try it now.
My slideshow here. Somebody let me know if that's not the case, and we will get started. So the goals here are to review the current guidance that's available from DESE and to discuss the best practices in order to navigate the special education landscape this fall, whether we're in a hybrid model or a remote model. I have not heard yet of a district who's doing full in-person for all students, so most kids are going to be in one of those two setups. So current guidance that's available, DESE has been reiterating since the spring that FAPE is required. So districts are required to provide that free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment that is required by both federal and state law. And DESE has indicated that, in the spring.
What did I do?
Of 2020, resources and supports was an acceptable model for providing services to students, but in the fall it's got to be an instruction and services model. If you look at the difference between those two quoted parts, you see that it's a lot more hands-on, it's a lot more direct instruction coming up than we all experienced in the spring. DESE has also directed districts to prioritize in-person instruction for certain groups of kids, students with disabilities, especially preschoolers, and students with significant and complex needs. And those students should be prioritized for in-person instruction, even if the rest of the district is remote or hybrid. And I know that DESE has been providing guidance in this regard to districts who have chosen to go all remote at the beginning of the year, that they do need to make space for folks in the building and make sure that these high needs populations are in the building. And so who is prioritized? That list right there is taken directly from the DESE guidance. Either you're checked in the high need box on your IEP documentation. Remote services were not feasible for you in the spring. You've got adaptive or alternative communication needs, homeless, foster congregate care, or English language learners. These plans were due to DESE on the 14th, and once districts turned in their plans, emails have started filtering out to parents about who is being prioritized for either 4 days a week or 5 days a week instruction, particularly for those districts in the hybrid model. And it sounds as though there are many districts who are being kind of over-inclusive, which is great, to offer the opportunity to have more in-person instruction to a broader range of students than they would necessarily have have to, but there's always the possibility that that a parent would disagree with the determination that the district made, either that their student is or is not eligible for more in-person instruction. And what to do in that case, documenting the basis for your disagreement, the basis for the parent's disagreement, the reasons that the student, for example, is not able to learn via remote instructional methodologies, and that either sets you up for the district changing your designation in the short term, possibly being one of the first students to enter back into the building on a more full-time basis as conditions hopefully change throughout the fall, or at the very least setting up a compensatory services claim down the line. Remote instruction, critical to note that parents can choose remote instruction for any student at any time. You don't need to have a quote unquote excuse, right? The global pandemic is your excuse. And the right to FAPE remains, even if a student with special needs is accessing their program remotely. There's probably some notice required from the district plans that I've seen. There's some notice required to transition from a remote cohort into the hybrid cohort, given space considerations, et cetera. But in theory, there should be less notice required to join that remote cohort if somebody, for example, were to get ill, or if the hybrid model turned out to not be workable for a student. So there are two plans that really govern what is going to happen for students with special needs in the fall. The first plan, obviously, is the IEP, right? And that IEP is to be drafted, updated, without regard to COVID-19. That is to say, your service delivery grid should presume 100% in-person instruction. Your IEP should be updated on an annual basis. Your 3-year reevaluation should be happening on schedule. And if a district over the course of this time proposes a change to your IEP service delivery grid that decreases services, takes away services, changes the placement, all of the same rights apply. Stay put, the right to go to due process if you disagree with what the student is receiving. And in order to implement an IEP, consent is required, as always, right? A rejected IEP cannot be implemented. However, there is also what's being called sort of an implementation plan that districts are required to both communicate to parents with and provide for students on IEPs. And this quote here is taken directly from the guidance from DESE. Need to contact parents, discuss how a given student's IEP service will be delivered if different than described in the student's IEP. And I don't know of anybody whose services are being delivered exactly as described in an IEP. So basically every special education family in the state should be having this conversation. Consent is not required for this implementation plan, but this plan should be in writing. This plan does not change your special education entitlement. It does not change your service delivery grid. It is the side plan as to how this particular student's IEP is going to be delivered in the hybrid model or the remote model. And again, this should be in writing because we want to be all on the same page in terms of what students are receiving, what districts are providing, and have our expectations aligned. So there are these implementations.
I just want to add that DESE has specified that those implementation plans are to be translated into the parent's native language, and if they need a translator for the discussions, those are to be provided. And I haven't heard whether that's happening or not.
Implementation considerations for both hybrid and remote. This is absolutely not an exhaustive list of all of the considerations when it comes to providing services. But in the hybrid, in the hybrid model, one big concern is how are we going to provide pull-out services, right? So if a student has speech pull-outs and PT pull-outs and OT pull-outs, how are we going to be providing these services on hybrid days versus remote days? Do we, for example, want a student to spend 3/4 of their day in the class, in the school, being pulled out for C-grid services? Some parents would say yes, that those secret services are more important than the classroom supports. Some parents would say no, the inclusive part of this day is much more important to my student than the pull-out services, and I want those pull-out services provided on a remote day. So again, that's a conversation that needs to happen. It's going to be an individualized thing from kid to kid. Another concern with the hybrid model is how to ensure that peer groupings are appropriate in a classroom where, let's say, kids with last names A through M are there on Monday and Tuesday, and kids with last names, N through Z are there on Thursday and Friday. How do we make sure that there's the appropriate sort of social dyads or the speech groups or the lunch bunches available on any given day? Another concern is compliance with these COVID-19 protocols, the masking, social distancing, hand washing. Some students with disabilities are obviously going to struggle mightily. Some typically developing kids are going to struggle mightily with these protocols. And there is the concern that students with disabilities are going to be disciplined in an outsized way. And DESE has provided guidance early and often to districts about, sort of cautioning them that discipline is not to follow, behavioral issues that are resulting either from, disability-related issues or still learning to follow these COVID-19 protocols. So this is going to be a really important conversation to have along the way as well. And then in terms of the remote instructional protocols, again, how do you provide a peer group to students who are learning alone in their houses? It's a question, obviously, that districts are going to be, thinking about, hopefully meeting with some specific groupings online. How are we going to ensure progress towards these goals? Social and emotional goals are not the easiest things to meet when we are remote. How are we going to be delivering B-grid services? How are we going to deliver, for example, special education push-in support via Zoom? And then I'll also touch on the last one, the devices and the connectivity. DESE has said that districts are responsible for providing students with devices and internet connectivity to the extent that that's required. So again, this fall, it's going to be all about communication and documentation. Parents need to be communicating with districts. Districts need to be communicating with parents. If anything is going poorly, it's going to be important to communicate because districts obviously have their hands full with all of this. Parents have their hands full, and documenting everything to make sure that there are no misunderstandings is going to be really critical. Evaluations, I'll just touch on that. I know that there's this giant backlog of evaluations districts should have provided during the spring, but obviously we're not able to provide given the closures. Outside evaluators are up and running largely. They're doing telehealth evaluations, they're evaluating outdoors, they're doing plexiglass barriers, different evaluators are doing different things. DESE has said that schools need to be exploring telehealth evaluation abilities. Some schools are doing evaluations this summer. Timelines are in effect, and we're just going to see how this goes. But this is a question to ask if you're expecting an evaluation from your school district at any point. Transportation is another piece that's come up a little bit. If a student has transportation in their IEP, a district is still required to do that. Districts are either having to do bigger vans to decrease the number of kids on vans or to ask parents to transport. And just wanted to flag that parents are not required to transport if the district asks them to. It is obviously a hardship, particularly for parents whose kids are in school outside the community, to do those round trip transports every day. And if it's in the IEP, the district does need to provide that transportation or reimbursement. So compensatory services, I've been going kind of fast because I really want to get to this. This guidance just came out yesterday. I would encourage everybody who has compensatory ed concerns, particularly advocates and attorneys, to go and take a look at this compensatory guidance. DESE has outlaid 3 separate types of compensatory services that should be included in the discussion. There's the general education recovery support, the COVID-19 compensatory services, and the new IEP services. I'm going to focus for purposes of this conversation on these COVID-19 compensatory services because that's basically what we are talking about when we're thinking about compensatory services, right? But these other 2 types of services are included in DESE's documentation for parents and teams to think about. DESE is basically saying schools need to gather data promptly to assess where kids are. They need to consider data from caregivers and other sources. Obviously, schools have not had eyes on kids in the same way parents and family members have for the last 5 months, and that teams need to convene to have this conversation. Unless parents and school team members agree to sort of a less formal forum, it needs to be a team decision. We'll go through the sort of the decision metrics here in a second, but the timeline for this is December 15th. DESE has instructed districts to have these plans in place for compensatory services, but also keeping in mind that the right to additional services may accrue over the course of this school year. None of us know how this school year is going to go, and there needs to be a plan between parents and school teams going backward in terms of compensatory services and also going forward, right? To make sure that a student either is getting the services that they need or that the compensatory ed claims are being considered along the way. And if you disagree as a parent or an advocate with anything that is happening with respect to the compensatory services conversation, note that in writing, and that may form the basis for an appeal later on. Just to note, there is a 2-year statute of limitations. So you have 2 years from the date of violation to file at the BSCA. And so here are these considerations. This is really the meat of the conversation that should be happening between parents and schools. And one thing to really flag on this is that that compensatory services are not based solely on regression, right? If you lose skills, you are certainly, you should certainly be entitled to compensatory services, but if you take a look at number 3 here, the student has failed to make effective progress, that also gives rise to compensatory services, right? So you don't have to regress in order to receive compensatory services. A failure to make effective progress also gives rise to the right to compensatory services. And so this is supposed to be an individualized conversation that parents and school teams are going to be having together. Just to note that it's not necessarily one-to-one correspondence with the missed IEP services. For example, if you missed 15 speech language services in the spring, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're entitled to 15 speech language services as compensatory ed, right? It's really a question of what is the student's individualized determination, what services do they need to make up for the fact that they did not receive those services in the spring. And also these COVID compensatory services may be appropriate for these other 2 groups of students who are on their way into the special education system, either as preschoolers or students who are on their initial evaluation, as well as students who turned 22 during the pandemic and are exiting the special education system. The right to compensatory services survives a 22nd birthday, right? There's good case law on that. And we know that if a student's rights were being violated when they were 21 and a half, for example, the compensatory service conversation should still happen. And here are 3 good places to find resources about this. About the guidance that DESE is putting out, the guidance that districts have. Your own district's plan or the district of residence, right, is obviously a really critical place to look. My own district has put out, I think, 135 pages worth of guidance. But also there's the COVID SPED desktop on the Mass DOE website, and then there's the on the desktop from the commissioner letters that happen every now and then. And then I included a compensatory services guidance link to that brand new compensatory services. And I'm going to send a copy of this to the Federation. They'll put it up with the recording so that these links will be clickable. That's what I've got. Thank you.
Okay. Switch back. Cross our fingers.
Eileen,
Yes.
up in the chat.
Sorry. Go ahead while I'm doing it.
Yep. So, sorry to find it. So before the video, someone just asked, can you give examples, or is there a tip how parents can communicate their observations, questions, concerns? Cover later, right?
I'm sorry. Yes, there is. And I'm sorry, say it one more time for me, Kate.
Can you give examples, or is there a template on how parents can communicate their questions, concerns, and
Yes, there are actually templates on how parents can document their concerns, and also how they can, they're going to really want to have a team meeting, honestly, whether it's a virtual meeting or it's a conversation over the phone or it's an in-person meeting. A team meeting is going to be the most helpful thing. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to, I just,
And then the other question someone asked is in that video.
I'm sorry, is what?
Sorry, I don't know if my internet is being troublesome. They want to know if they'll be getting the slides from this video that you just played.
I'm going to send you the video and the slides. It was actually, that was a short clip out of an hour-long presentation. So you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff. But yes, I'll send you Melanie's video and slides. Because I think she did a nice summary overall of the compensatory services, particularly around the CCS or COVID compensatory services. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the other things that the districts will be offering. I'm going to start with the one on the bottom, new IEP services to address new disabilities, additional disabilities to kids who already have IEPs, as well as kids who have not yet had an IEP, including but not limited to mental health is the way that DESE put it. I think we are all expecting to see a lot of anxiety. I think all of our families, including the kids, we have a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. And so just keep in mind that if these are issues that are interfering with the student's ability to make progress in their education, that qualifies for an emotional IEP most likely. So, and that is something that can be very protective for the student if they start to have behavior problems. So, it's worth keeping that in mind, that new services are an option. Just talking in general about recovery from the regression that all of these kids have been through, the schools are going to make, they are being instructed to make services available for all students, not just those with disabilities, addressing both the emotional and the educational needs and gaps in learning. So let's talk about that one a little more. General education recovery supports. All students, including with students' disabilities, are able to have services based on, I love this expression, the unexpected suspension of in-person education. Students, the DESE notes that students may demonstrate the impact of trauma as well, and that supports can be provided either through the core instruction, through the district's tiered support system, or their curriculum accommodation plan. Things that they can do as a district. There can be academic scaffolding, different accommodations. We have to expect that there's going to be differentiated course instruction in the curriculum based on the benchmarking data, the assessment data, and observations that teachers will be doing either in person or remotely. Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions for students who have a really demonstrated academic need, behavior plans, counseling, and other emotional support. There's been a lot written in the school psychology literature about how to try to best address helping kids get back to school, helping things get to feeling normal and safe for students. So that's going to be an important part of the services. And support for kids following the health and safety protocols, which I think we all have some apprehension about. Kids are going to be kids. Just pop that up a little bit. Okay. This is just what Melanie talked about in her slides. So I'm not going to go through this. We already went through it, but I'm giving it to you as a reference. The guidance itself is, I think, 36 pages, but it's fairly straightforward, and I'm really happy to talk to anybody who has questions about compensatory services for families. I think any child on an IEP, the family should be prepared to have a discussion with their team about what compensatory services would be appropriate under the CCS. And
we have
the
a
main
question in the chat.
Go ahead.
difference between the district system of support and the district curriculum accommodation plan?
I don't know the answer to that, honestly. I think it's going to depend on the district and on the school in terms of what levels of accommodation they turn to at what point. Does anybody have a comment on that? I'm not an educator by training, so I'm opening it up to you guys. You may know more than I do.
I think because they have the tiered systems of different levels of supports versus a curriculum accommodation. Those are different, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the intent is to not necessarily do a curriculum accommodation that's intended to be permanent, but to have the tiered supports in addition to the curriculum so that the student is catching up. I mean, a lot of times with special education, we do curriculum adjustments where the student is not learning the same material or not necessarily the breadth of material. And that, I think, is not the goal. So if it's possible to get the student working at the level they should be working at. Does that make sense? Nobody? Okay. I'm sorry, I've got an admit here. Okay. Do you guys have any other questions? That's a lot of material that we just went through.
I'm wondering, we always say to tell parents, communicate with the school. Obviously, the first step is the teacher, but usually that's not the best step. So how do they identify who exactly and how to contact them, especially now, starting a new year, with or without an IEP?
Yeah. Well, I think if your child has an IEP, there is an educational team leader. It's not generally the teacher who is assigned to your child, and that can be a really good place to start, especially if you have concerns about services like OT, PT, speech, things like that, that are not going to be the teacher's accommodations to your student. It's going to depend on the question, honestly. I mean, the teacher or the educational team leader are not the right person to contact if they need computers or if they need internet access. I would go to the principal for something like that. It's going to be, I think, a matter of trying to kind of over communicate for families, which I think is a real challenge for a lot of families. It's not what we're used to. Let me talk a little bit. Any more, Kate?
Yes. One person at charter schools fall with this guidance?
Hmm?
Where
What?
do charter schools fall with this guidance?
I believe charter schools are following it, but don't quote me. I'll have to look, but I will get you the answer.
And another person commented that their son has an IEP and they reach out to the person in charge of that IEP and the teacher, and they usually send an email to the team.
That's a good way to go. And I'm going to cover this some more in some of the tips for parents, but document everything. If you have a phone conversation with someone at the school, send them a follow-up email and just say, thank you, this is what we talked about. Does this sound right to you? Whatever confirm it in an email and get a confirmation, because you really need a paper trail with this stuff, unfortunately. For families who are working with IEPs, one of the first things they're going to want to do is reach out to their team and probably have a team meeting. Most team meetings are still being virtual because they're trying to limit the number of people coming into the building. They might have an in-person team meeting, but it could be virtual. They may be offered the virtual, especially districts that are only doing remote. This is a tip sheet that we did at the Federation for parents on dealing with virtual IEP meetings, the kind of questions you want to think about beforehand. I'm giving you the links to all of this stuff, by the way. We also have workshops, webinars on basic rights and understanding the IEP. We've got them in English and Spanish for those two. I'm doing Portuguese in the next couple of weeks. We're still working on building up our library of webinar recordings, but we can find a way to get the information out to you. And the other thing that I'm doing is I'm doing kind of virtual IEP workshops. If you have parents, even if it's one family who wants help going through their IEP, I'm very happy to do that. I'm going to have office hours set aside for that. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm going out to, actually in September, I'm going to go to the Greenfield FRC's open house. And I'm really excited about it because I get to get out of my house. But I'm going to bring a tent and we're going to sit there. And if people want to go through IEPs and do an IEP, kind of review, I'm happy to do that or answer questions. So if you're doing in-person events, if you're going to be doing outdoor things, anytime you think it might be useful to have me come out, please just ask. And I'm really excited to do that. Okay, we went through some questions already, Kate? I have a question for you guys. I've heard from several districts, I heard it from Holyoke and possibly, I want to say Southborough, are saying that they're not going to be having the high priority special needs kids coming in person at all, even though they're being told by DESE to do that. I have raised this question with special education attorneys, and what I keep hearing is that, oh, that's going to be behind the scenes conversation. DESE's putting pressure on them to do this. Have you guys run into that? Has anybody heard they're not having in-person services? Even for the highest need kids? No. Well, that's good. Recommendations are not law, so the districts will be advised and pressured by DESE to do these things, but the districts have some leeway. Okay. Let's talk about concerns about remote learning. I think this is really the core of what we need to do with planning for getting our kids back into the classroom or getting them going on remote education with a better outcome than we had in the spring. I mean, DESE has set higher expectations, but it's going to be the process of getting it to work. We know that all of the districts are doing at least hybrid and some are fully remote. They have to, because they're going to have classes. If they have a hybrid, they're going to have classes that get quarantined. They're going to have people who opt out of having their kids go to school in person. And all of the districts seem to have different versions from what I've seen of how they're going to engage the students that they're losing remotely. And we know that they're losing kids who are not able to access remotely. Parents have a really important role here, and I know it's burdensome for a lot of parents because we're not all teachers. Some of us have day jobs, and a lot of us, especially for kids with special needs, there was a team in place to support our students, and all of a sudden, it took a village, and then there's no village. It's just you and your kid and the computer. So it's very difficult. We know we're losing kids to online instruction. Boston estimated they lost about 25% of the kids last spring. They just didn't engage. It varies district to district, but even Newton, where I live and know a lot of people, had something around 20% of kids who just didn't log on at all. So, very different sorts of districts and involvements. Newton is a very special education heavy district and very inclusive. So a group called Parents Action Together surveyed 1,500 families. I don't have a lot of details on the survey. I got this from WBUR, but I think it's very interesting to note that they broke it out by household income, and kids whose household income is less than $25,000 are something like 10 times more likely to not be engaged in remote learning than kids whose household income is $100,000. So not having consistent device access. The kids with lower income households are 3 times as likely. Parents reporting that remote learning is going poorly was also much more common in families that had a lower income. So we have to figure this out. I mean, the districts have to figure it out, but I think as family resource centers, you have a huge role here in helping families figure out how to navigate this. Student engagement versus a punitive approach. I have a lot of concerns from what I've been hearing and reading. I know probably some of you saw the Boston Globe article that came out on families that are having 51As filed on them or had them filed in the spring for not being engaged. We really need attendance data, honestly, to be able to identify the students we're missing and figure out who needs extra help. And some districts are being very proactive about that. Some are assigning teachers to check in on certain groups of students, offering other services. Some of them are giving in-home services and teacher visits, things like that. But again, the family communication and the students' communication for our older kids is really, really important. I have heard from families that say that the district is not offering this or that. And when we talk to the district, they will say, we emailed them 6 times, we called them 4 times, we sent somebody over to their house. Sometimes it's just gonna be the, you know, the onus is gonna be on the family to be the squeaky wheel and make sure that they are getting the notice that they need out of the school. We know that districts have talked about filing child requiring assistance for truancy. We know that in the past, some have filed 51As for educational neglect. Most commonly, what I've seen is those are in cases where the district is having trouble contacting the family. So answering emails, answering phone calls, even when there's a problem and you don't want to talk about it, is a huge factor in not getting a filing. And we know that 51A filings are much more common in our lower income, minority, and immigrant communities, and that's the case overall, and also with this educational neglect thing. DCF screened out a lot of those complaints in the spring. That's not the approach we want them to be taking. They need to be much more involved with engaging these kids. So some questions that come up around engagement, at least for me, are, do the families have the computers? Do they have remote access? I mean, you heard Melanie Jarbo say that it is the responsibility of the districts to provide this, but is this actually happening? Do families have enough computers or tablets for all the kids in their school, in their different ages? Do they have reliable internet access? That is a huge problem, and it was in the spring, particularly in Western Massachusetts, but really all over families have had issues with that, and there should be solutions to getting them hotspots. This is what I hear a lot from parents. The systems, the programs, the apps, all the different platforms that they have to use. Parents get so confused. I'm sorry, but you know, it took me a while to learn how to use Zoom. You know, if I had to use the Google School apps and all of the different things, parents may not be as technologically savvy as even their kids could be, but it's a problem because they are in charge of being the IT officer. So if they're not comfortable, what can we do for them? How can we help them be more comfortable? You know, how can we encourage parents to get some training around the things that they need? Schools to provide it. Are the supports available to the parents in their native language? They should be. But, and for things like IEP documents, it's mandated legally that they have to be. But for things like, how do you turn on the Google School apps? You know, that's going to be a real challenge. And that may be something that we try to have to address at the local level. Oops, sorry, backwards. Working parents can be relying on their older children for childcare or for supervising the education. Working students, a lot of our older students are working. We're, you know, in the midst of an economic crisis, and you know, if they can get a job, they're contributing, and that's a big problem with them accessing their learning. Okay. So how do we help? I'm going to open up a white screen in a minute. I want to throw out some ideas that I've heard from different FRCs, but this is the part I really hope that you guys will contribute to, because we know that these are systemic problems. We're in the midst of a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a racial equity crisis in this country, and all of that is contributing to our school crisis. And so how do we help these families? Some FRCs have talked about setting up tutoring systems, and I actually think this is a great idea. College students, retired teachers. I'm not sure what you would need to do in terms of queries and things to try to make that accessible, but one-to-one tutoring, even online, can be incredibly helpful. It can be more helpful to a student than sitting for 5 days in their class where they're not understanding what's happening. So, and students, college students, graduate students in education can do this with our kids and help them. My son is a senior in college and he's a physics major, and he is dragging his cousin through physics by the skin of his teeth. They're on Zoom all the time. So some FRCs are talking about babysitting training for teenagers so that they can help with childcare, because we know that there is a massive childcare crisis right now. And some of our cities and towns have no openings in younger child daycare. So we know some libraries are giving out hotspots if you're having trouble accessing that through your school. The different ARCs and other organizations are giving away devices if we need extra devices and the school won't provide it. We need to help parents be, as I said, technologically savvy. We need to help the parents be able to feel comfortable with the technology. And this is a really big one. We have to help parents, whether they've got special education or not. We have to help them get used to asking for what they need and expecting it to happen, because they should be. You know, the schools have a responsibility here, and they need to be comfortable in saying what they need. And that's the first step, I think, in getting a collaborative communication with the school. You know, being honest and respectful and saying what you need. So those are some of my thoughts. I am going to open up a whiteboard and ask for yours. What issues do you think your families are facing in your communities in going back to school? What strategies are you trying? That's what I am looking at. And I'm going to see if I can do this on top of it. There we go. Okay, you guys done whiteboards before? They're kind of fun. Look at the top of your screen, and there should be a little icon. I think it's a crosshatchy one on yours. It's different on mine, of course. But there will be a thing that says text. And you can click on the text and you can say whatever. You know, put in what your thoughts are. What are the biggest issues for you? Huh?
Sorry, I just want to help people find it. If you go up to the top of your screen, there should be a drop-down menu called View Options. If you click on that and then click the word Annotate from the drop-down menu, then you should get a toolbar where you can choose to draw or use text, etc.
You can draw if you want. So, great. Thank you. Let's just take a couple minutes and put down what you're thinking about, what you're working on with your FRCs, community coalitions, wherever you're working, what you see as the biggest problems. Because I think this is going to be a process we're going to go through in the fall, where we're going to help each other figure out strategies. Meals, yeah. I know several schools that are doing kind of grab and go meals for hybrid days and providing not only lunch, but a couple of days worth of food because the students aren't coming back as quickly. Offering a school Q&A session for parents. Doing something online would be great. Honestly, doing it in multiple languages. If your community has a population of parents who speak Spanish, those things should be in Spanish. Childcare on days off, yeah. And how are we going to work that? I mean, almost nobody is going back for full days. And every district's plan I've seen has said kind of like, we're working on it. I'm just going to move a few things around just so I can see. Yeah, food options, childcare, parent work schedules. Parents can't monitor the schoolwork. Do you guys have ideas about that? I mean, what can we do with that? I think online tutoring might help. You know, access to small group instruction for schoolwork.
You froze for a moment. Can you repeat that question?
No, I was just looking at the problem of parents who are working and can't monitor schoolwork. That's, I think, a huge piece of students not being engaged. At least it would be for my kids if I wasn't around. So, no, I mean, it's hard to know how much your student is actually getting online and how much they're getting out of it if you can't be there. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think we're gonna solve these, but I think it's good to bring them out and talk about them and think about strategies. So if you guys want to, I mean, speak up too. If you're on the phone and you can't do this, feel free to share strategies your FRC is trying.
Okay. Hi, Candace.
Hi, Candace.
I was just thinking if somebody just typed about teachers and scheduling other times to do the work, but if the teachers could record the lessons so that when the parents get home from work, they can do them with their kids.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know, just an idea. I'm full-time working 4 kids, 3 IEPs, like, so I'm just, I don't know, just an idea.
What's the district doing? Are they going remote or hybrid?
So I asked the charter school question because they're all enrolled in charter schools. So right now I have, they're at 2 different schools. 1 kid will be full-time 4 days a week. The other 3 will be fully remote. My kindergartner is going to be fully remote. I don't know how that works.
Yikes. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of parents are trying to figure out how you do that. Some schools are doing what they call asynchronous learning, and sometimes that involves the teacher taping a lesson. A lot of teachers have been reluctant to have their lessons taped when they're doing them live with the class. That has actually been a teachers union issue for a lot of unions because they don't want to be subject to the scrutiny and criticism that they will probably get. You know, because they're not used to having parents watching them teach. So yeah, it's problematic.
This is Rosalind. I think we're having a problem with families that do not want to go on camera because of the living situation, or they're not here legally, so they won't go on camera. So they just go ghost. And we've been going out to those families, and the school gave us a list, and we would go to the homes just to see if we can get in touch with them. We'd leave a note if they weren't there, but that we were doing that to keep the police from going to their door, because that's who they were sending with the police. So,
yeah.
And that's scary when especially if you don't speak the language. So I think what we found is that a couple of people, the kids were answering the phone, the kids were answering the phone, and just saying nobody's home, because the parent didn't speak English. So we had a couple of those. And the others are just really don't want to engage. You know, their mental health is poor. They had mental health issues before this, and it's just gotten, you know, worse during this time.
Yeah.
So those are the ones we're seeing. We have a school liaison who does like what's this tech savvy thing for parents. He does Zoom meeting with them. So that's good. But he only speaks English. So we really need to get somebody who speaks Spanish to do that with him. But
is that something we could do collaboratively between the FRCs? I mean, if you're doing it like a tech savvy session, why not have 2 or 3 FRCs with different communities participate?
I think we actually are doing that in the Northeast region. We're sharing like our parenting journeys and things like that. So we just started that. So that's probably something we can do with our school liaison, kind of doing that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think too that if you wanted to do anything around Q&A around special education, I could probably get those set up in Spanish, Portuguese, Haitian Creole. I'm still working on the Cape Verdean Creole.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be
Chinese,
awesome.
Vietnamese. We could do like an evening session on Q&A on special education.
That'd be great, because I know we in my little area, there's actually 3 FRCs in Middlesex County, because it's a large county. But in my little area, I think we had at least two school districts that had that special education waiver that they were trying to get parents to sign. So that was really, that was kind of touchy. So those things are coming up. Like they were trying to get them to waive their services. I only saw one of them, but so that was a problem we were having.
That is illegal under both state and federal law.
I know.
I'm trying not to use swear words. That one makes me angry. So.
Yeah, it's
We have
ridiculous.
A couple comments in the chat too.
I'm sorry?
We have a couple comments in the chat too when you have a moment.
Go ahead.
All right. So the first one says, perhaps parents can work with teachers to decide on best child to do schoolwork that may have to take place after school. And another one says parents can reach out to their local universities, colleges, and community colleges for students who are interested in tutoring students, and they can write a paper about it and get college credit if the parent agrees.
Mm-hmm.
And Candace linked an article from the Boston Globe about your child's no-show virtual school. You may get a call from the state's foster care agency, so folks can click on that. Another person said Q&As in different languages would be fantastic. And lastly, there's an article about 51As being filed on families for not logging on. I think that's a follow-up to the link.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I ask
You
about,
know what? We actually
timing?
have.
do schools
Sorry.
have to stick, are there still like school hours, or are there no rules now? Can parents push schools to offer classes later in the day or at different times?
That's going to be something that works out on a district by district basis. The rules that they have are they have to have 170 days of instruction, and it's hours of instruction in a year. For elementary school, it's 850. For secondary schools, it's 935 hours in the school year. How they break that out is district by district. And frankly, teachers' unions will be involved in that discussion. So, and I have a lot of sympathy for the teachers because a lot of them are home with their kids too. And, you know, doing the same juggle that the rest of us are. So, but it's, you know, your teacher may not want to teach at 7 o'clock at night. So how do you make that work? And every district's going to have a different plan for remote learning. I mean, our district has a remote learning academy, and then they have hybrid, but they're separate. So the days that the kids aren't in school under the hybrid, they're getting something else. They're being taught remotely in a different program as opposed to the remote learning academy. And what happens when, you know, a school has to close or a class has to quarantine? It's really not clear. You know, it seems like a kind of crazy plan to me. But
Yeah.
I think we have a lot of crazy plans out there, honestly.
I also want to mention that this is also goes, you're looking at the social determinants of health here as well. Because I want to say that I found out last night that Concord School District of Concord is offering, has secured COVID testing for daily COVID testing. That's not going to happen in another district. They were, you know, things like that. That's a really affluent community. So they can do this. They can make sure that these kids have, each kid has a laptop, and, you know, if they need a hotspot to go outside, so they're, you know, they're separate during the day. They, you know, these affluent school districts are going to be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I live in Newton, which is also an affluent community, and the I'm on the board of the Newton Schools Foundation, which is a nonprofit that supports the schools. And basically, we cleaned out the nonprofit treasury this year to buy Chromebooks because the school budget was tight enough that providing a device for every kid was a real problem. So, but now they've got it so that the kids up to grade 2 have tablets, and the kids who are older have a Chromebook, and it's one-to-one. But it's a huge struggle. I mean, I know we've got families with multiple kids in different grades on totally different schedules and one computer. And what are you supposed to do with that? You know, if you've got kids who need to be on at the same time. So.
I just have a couple of quick questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Not sure if you would know this, but how are the unions working with DESE?
Well, the unions, the Mass Teachers Association, and some teachers have been part of the task force on reopening, working with DESE, but my impression is that DESE is somewhat buffered from the unions, but that the individual school districts are dealing with their unions very heavily. Yeah, and you know, school nurses, why weren't school nurses part of the process in designing some of this stuff? It's interesting.
We're on, Taunton has task force on reopening, and you know, majority of our staff have been heavily involved in each of the subcategories that they have. And I feel like anytime a question is brought up, someone that is on the union is like, oh no, the union needs to negotiate that. Like, come on, like we need to make these plans for these kids and these families.
I know, I agree.
It's,
I mean, I understand why they have teachers unions, but, you know, I think everybody has to have flexibility now.
yeah.
Nobody's asking my opinion. Okay, I've got a couple more slides, so let's keep going unless you guys want to keep
I
talking.
have one more thing that I think I missed from the chat that I just want to throw out there. Someone wrote a suggestion about getting tutors for kids through local colleges.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. And, you know, honestly, I don't think it has to be local colleges, because if you're doing it remotely, there's lots of options potentially. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find my presentation back again. And I seem to have to do this every time. Okay. Wait a moment here. Screen sharing is not the smoothest part of this. Here we go. Okay. Questions about reopening. One of the ways I think that it's good to help families kind of engage in the process of communicating is to think about talking to the schools before we start, talking to the teachers, talking to the school staff. There's lots of questions that could be asked. I've just listed some of them here. What method of communication do you prefer? Is a good one for teachers, because it's, you know, respecting their time, but also indicating that you're going to make this regular. You know, what's the schedule? Outdoor meet and greets or virtual meet and greets before school starts can be a really great idea. One thing that some districts are doing is teachers are kind of giving the kids a virtual tour before they get into school, including, you know, the teachers got the mask on and then they're taking their phone and walking through the hall and, you know, washing hands, going to the classroom, all the things that the students can expect. And I will show you, I have a link here to another document that we have on the Federation website that I'll link you to. Questions you can ask about school reopening. And you know what? I'm going to try to get these translated because we have them in English and that's not such a great help sometimes. But what you could ask about in-person learning, what you can ask about remote learning, really to help them understand the district's plan. So hopefully that's a useful resource. You might want to make a list for your parents of just simple questions that, you know, a place to start. Okay, where were we? When it comes to all families really, but really especially special education families, document, document, document. It's what she said in the video, what Melanie said, it's communication and documentation. I know I sound like a broken record on this, but it makes such a huge difference if you can note what happened, when the kids got it, how things went. We have a template of a student remote learning record that I will link you to. Oh, this is our general website. Let's find the student learning record. Yeah, you can see basically it just lists out what happens, the teacher, how the student participated. Did they respond? Did they engage? It's, I think, really important to just keep an eye on those things as much as parents can. Did not manage to lose that again. Okay. I know it's hard. And one thing I've heard from parents that was a little bit unexpected was that some schools are, rather some parents are having the experience of hearing their teachers for the first time and not liking what they hear. So, you know, if the teacher is being harsh on the child, if the teacher is not communicating well, if your teacher is talking down to your child, whatever it is, you know, it's important to note, because a big part of helping kids get reconnected is going to be having that respectful relationship with the teachers. And I think we all know from in-person learning that not every teacher and child is a fit. But if it's a problem, it's something parents need to talk about, diplomatically. Okay, let's talk a little bit about helping kids get ready. And this is all keeping in the context that a lot of kids have anxiety about this. A lot of kids have uncertainty that their parents can't really help with because they've got uncertainty too, because the plans are not good and they're not communicated yet. So whatever can be done to engage the family and the student with the teachers and the classmates. If the school can provide a class list so you can do virtual play dates or, go for a walk in a park, work on practicing social distancing, whatever parents can do, whatever's the right way to, for your community to try to connect people, that will help students be more comfortable and feel safer when they go to school. Everybody says this, it's easier said than done, but if students have a dedicated schoolwork spot at home, it could be the kitchen table. It doesn't really matter as long as it's their spot for when they're in school. Good lighting, as few distractions as possible. Headphones are your best friend. People talk about giving out technology. I'm like, give them headphones. Because especially if you've got more than one kid trying to do this at once in a small space, or the parents are trying to work online in the same space, headphones. Kids love to go back to school shopping, get the backpack, get the whatever. I'm not saying that they have to do that, or that you guys, I know you give out backpacks, but backpacks are good. They're a place to store your stuff. It feels like you're going to school. And just having sort of a special collection of school supplies. This is your school supplies for the new year. It helps kids get in the mindset that this is going to be something that they may be used to that may feel normal. Get kids back on the school year sleep schedule. Boy, is this a case of me saying do as I say and not as I do, because I have older kids and this is tough. If they get on a vacation schedule, and especially if their remote learning is not happening at 8 o'clock in the morning, if their remote learning starts at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, good luck getting them out of bed. And we know that kids, especially older kids, have a natural sleep schedule that runs later than younger kids or adults. So, but as much as possible, if they can be in a routine, that helps. Practice wearing masks. Kids wearing masks can be really useful, just to help them get some time wearing a mask. It's going to be tough. I mean, they're going to have to wear masks on the bus. Everybody has to wear them on the bus. And grades, I think 2 and above, have to wear them all the time in school except for their mask breaks, which is going to be something of a challenge. I'm going to pull this up again because I know where this is and I didn't hyperlink it. I was having some problems with my presentation last night, so but let me show you this one. Tips to help children wear masks. This is something that we put together at the Federation with social stories, and it can be good for younger children to help them, figure out that they need to keep the mask on. We wear masks on YouTube, things like that, just to help them understand that this is just the way life is now when we go out in public. And of course, it's helpful if the adults will model that. Sometimes that is an issue too. My beloved husband has trouble using his mask. So, okay, hang on a second. I gotta get this down. Okay. I'm going to stop my share and start it again because that is what I have to do to get this to work. Sorry about all the stopping and starting. Sometimes it's useful to actually see the resource when it's in front of you. So, okay. And every time I open something, I manage to lose the thing I'm going back to. Anyway, while I'm doing that, do we have questions? Do people want to comment on ways to help kids with getting ready? Are there other suggestions you've heard?
I hate to throw in another problem, but what do we think is going to happen with this new flu vaccine mandate?
Oh, yeah.
Are they really not going to teach these kids if they don't get the vaccine?
Yeah, they really are. It's going to be like the varicella vaccine and other vaccines that they have to have. And
how would that, I'm sorry, I was going to say, how would that work if you're schooling from home?
Right.
well, if you're schooling from home, I don't know the answer to that. If you're going to be required to have it to be home, if your district is fully remote. My understanding is that it's going to be for kids who are going in person, but it's going to be something that we're going to have to try to figure out.
Yeah, I wasn't.
I tend to feel like it's not a bad thing unless the child has a medical reason why they shouldn't be doing that, because it's likely to really help us with being able to, get the kids, keep them in school, and keep the spread of the disease down. I read a study out of South America where their seasons are reversed from ours, that in the Southern Hemisphere, they've basically gotten rid of the flu this year. There just isn't much transmission at all because people wear masks and they wash their hands. So, okay, let me come back to this and share my screen. I'm almost done with my slides, but I do have a couple more. So. Okay, I want to do another whiteboard. We don't have to if you guys don't want to, but ideas on helping families engage in the community, and ideas you have on helping students really be prepared for school. I think that we're all going to have to think outside of the box on this. I mean, we could have all of the sort of, standard resources that we have, but now how do I clear this? Okay, shut that down, shut that down, screen share. Well, it's not letting me have a nice clean whiteboard. So why don't we just talk about it? Do you guys have suggestions for each other on how you help your students really be engaged? Thoughts on, getting kids into school, what's going to be useful? Anybody? Okay.
There's a comment in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Families can cite religious affiliation. Please do not recommend this. But I was an educator in the school system for 12 years. But families, often a child cannot be denied an education.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's always going to be an option for families. And if you, for any reason, think it's not safe or reasonable for your child to have the flu shot, that's a conversation to have with the pediatrician. I mean, my perspective on it is that one of my kids has asthma, and so we've had flu shots for years. And it's just a thing we do, usually in October, where the whole family goes and gets flu shots. And what I've seen from the literature is that it does both decrease the chances that you're going to get the flu and the severity of the flu if you get it. But obviously it's not for everybody, so that's going to be something that families are going to have to figure out and consider. Let me give you some resources. This is all going to be, I'm making you a resource sheet with all of this information that I've given you. These are the DESE guidelines and the ones that we've talked about, the ones that Melanie had in her presentation. I'll give you hers as well. Oh, hi, Tanya. And let me show you, the Federation has, we have on our website a whole bunch of different resources for you, particularly related to COVID, but DESE guidelines, health guidance, all kinds of things like that. So it's worth checking out, it's worth referring to. One of these days, I'm gonna figure out how to do this. Okay, so I'm gonna ask for final questions, comments. This was a very valuable discussion for me. I really appreciate all of your contributions to it.
I have just a comment. I know when they're reopening and trying to prioritize the kids with special needs to be in person. I think there's a lot of concerns about those kids being able to keep a mask on, especially those with intellectual disabilities, and understanding and getting them. I know right now we have a lot of families that are practicing at home with the kids to keep it on, finding the best mask. Do you need a shield? So those sorts of things. But I know that's a huge worry for some of the parents with kids with ID or DD. And I know one of the things they were talking, we had actually went to look at a space where kids would be, and they are 6 feet apart, like it's perfectly 6 feet apart, nose to nose they do. And, but the issue is that, first of all, they're not gonna sit still. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, how do you get them to keep their mask on? Is the door gonna be open? So we had lots of questions when we went to visit this space. And I can't tell you what it is because they weren't supposed to let me in, but they did. So, but it's just, that was one of the concerns, is that how are you going to be able to have them keep their masks on? So you're going to need that more than that 6 feet buffer. You're probably going to need a little more when it comes to kids with those sorts of disabilities, autism. So that's one comment something that I wanted to let out when I went to look at a place. That's a huge issue I was having.
I mean, most kids with disabilities and otherwise can physically wear a mask. For kids who can't, that's, I mean, just in terms of being able to get enough air and safety. There is a whole protocol that DESE has put out for the people who work directly with them, because a lot of our kids who have severe medical needs, who have more autism impacts, maybe, they're getting a lot of hands-on care, and their caregivers really have to be right in there with them, touching them. So it looks a lot like what you see in the COVID testing, where they're supposed to wear gowns, mask, face shield. In terms of kids in classrooms, it's tough, and it's not just going to be the kids with intellectual disabilities. A lot of kids with autism have sensory issues. I mean, if you can't have a tag in your t-shirt, imagine how you're going to deal with a mask. But a lot of that is practice and learning to try to build the tolerance. And a lot of it is trial and error about what mask is comfortable. I mean, those of us who've been wearing masks all summer know some masks are harder to breathe through than others. I actually do a lot better with the paper disposable ones myself. I find them a lot more comfortable if I have to wear it for a long time. Like the surgical style mask, the blue ones. Sometimes you can either buy or jury rig a mask so that it has an elastic strap around the back, almost like you put on glasses so the kid isn't going to lose the glasses. That is a little bit easier to keep on them than ones they can just do like this with, or that can fall off. I think we know this is going to be imperfect. I mean, all kids are going to, run into each other's space, whether they're taking somebody's toy or wanting to share. It's just normal. So we have to teach them a new way. One thing that I found, I actually volunteered in a COVID clinic this summer on Martha's Vineyard, and I got a face shield, and I didn't like it because with the mask on, it fogged. But kids can wear face shields, and they make them and sell them on Amazon with little baseball caps. And that is not as good for the student in terms of they're not getting any filter on other people's air, but at least if they sneeze, they're not going to sneeze in your face. So that's one possible, part measure. So I have a baseball cap with a face shield on it. And they make them in all kinds of different configurations. Some parents are helping kids with making masks. You can buy cheap cotton masks and then decorate them with, puffy paint or tie-dye or something like that. It might sound silly, but if kids buy into having the mask, that can be helpful. They cannot share masks. They cannot trade masks with their friends. And honestly, I wouldn't want to be the teacher enforcing that. So it's a problem.
I just have a comment. My son's been going to his preschool all summer, and the EEC guidelines are very different than the DESE guidelines. And the little kids have to wear masks all day, every day, and they get mask breaks and everything else. And they're doing it with the preschool, so like it can definitely be done. And like, I don't know, now there's used to it. My little guy's like asking, oh, my mask, you know, and he's like, gotta wear mask, COVID. So, I mean, they're educating them, and I don't know, I think that piece of it can be done, but I do understand the kids with like severe, you know, like sensory stuff and asthma and things like that, it's harder. But the paper masks are more breathable. I agree with that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's trial and error for what's comfortable for the kids, but I think that's very encouraging that you can teach preschool kids to, you know, to know they have to keep their mask on. They're probably reminding their parents. Yeah, I mean, in my town, we had some in-person extended school year services this year for some of the kids. And a lot of those kids had pretty impactful intellectual disabilities. And the kids you would consider would have trouble learning to use a mask, they learned to use the mask. It's the norms in the classroom. And, you know, of course they had to be reminded, but they learned to use the mask and keep it on all day. So I think
I have a comment.
we may have trouble with our typical kids too, just rebelling against it. What's your comment?
I have a question about some of the things that are happening as a result of COVID, for example, the mental health needs, anxiety. So I was curious if DESE had been thinking about, or, you know, sure, of all the children who are going to have a PTSD diagnosis based on COVID and things that happen related to COVID and the chain of events. Because the PTS diagnosis and as PTS in general, PTSD rather, that will be coming down the pike within the next year or two, or maybe even sooner, is going to really be incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And it's going to be, I mean, I think it's very widespread that most of us are experiencing this as traumatic in one way or another. And some kids are really going to be feeling it. I have not seen anything out of DESE. I know that it's something that school psychologists are bracing for. I think that we can expect that there's going to be a lot of potential need for behavior plans, for new interventions in schools, for new IEPs. But I also think that, you know, the more we can get community support for the kids, you know, we can get them therapeutic services. And that, I know, is a challenge for all of you that you're facing, because there's waiting lists all over the place. But the more we can try to find that in our communities, or even get kids to access telehealth if they can. Some kids have done well with it. Yeah. I always feel like this presentation, all my COVID topics are really kind of bummer presentations, but I'm going to end by saying, I feel that in some ways this is an opportunity for us, because we've had a status quo for so long that had a lot of inequity in it, and everything is shaken up now. I mean, we're going to have new methods of learning that may work for some kids better than they did before. We're going to have, hopefully, access to more things like tutoring and extra services for kids. You know, I don't think we should accept that this is going to be, that our achievement gaps are just going to increase enormously and kids are going to be terribly impacted by this forever. I think, you know, this is a place where we can try to do the interventions now. So thank you.